So welcome everybody. It's me, your host Dan, at the Non Negotiable Show. Special guest Gary. Uh, Introduction. If you guys are watching this video, you obviously know who Gary is. We used a lot of his creations in our mock negotiations. The behavioral stairway change, which I'm sure he's going to correct me. I think now he calls it the cooperation uh, steps, which, first steps, listening, gets you give you some empathy to your counterpart, builds rapport, and then you get into an influence zone, which leads to collaboration. Gary, since he was 6 years old, was inspired through media, wanted to be in the FBI, hostage negotiation. That was not even a profession back then. So he was like the second phase. He's trained our idol, Chris Voss. And gosh, he's got the Netflix special with Waco. And so we're probably getting a lot of viewers searching for Gary from that Waco. And we're going to start off with, I asked the group a question. What can I ask Gary that hasn't been covered in a lot of the videos? Many have seen a lot of his interviews. And Gary, surprisingly, the main question was, it seemed you were a bit hesitant to jump on the show because you thought it was related to business, which, it made everybody curious. Like, Chris Foss is such a big guy in turning negotiations into a business. I come from a communication background. And so many are wondering, Gary, why didn't you go that route? We know you wanted a challenge when you were young, and so FBI, that's a big challenge. Take it from a military guy. That's tough. And so did you find going into the business route with this is too challenging, or?
Not at all. First of all, I don't think you realize you didn't mention my last name. It's Gary Nessner, for those who don't know.
Because I will mispronounce it so bad.
Everybody does. It's no big deal.
It looks like
Nosner,
video,
but it's just got
someone
a silent
pronouncing your last name, and I found none. So I'm hoping he's gonna want to correct me on that. So please,
well, it's
all the
funny.
viewers, how is it pronounced?
It's so mispronounced that I even had Random House comment on it in the book, and they said we don't do that, and I said, well, yes, you will, because everybody says Nosner. That's what it looks like, but it's Nessner.
Yes.
It's just a silent O. That's all. But yeah. So well, you mentioned Chris. Chris worked for me in the FBI, and when he left the FBI, he went up and did some training with Harvard, and I think he decided to try to incorporate the lessons from law enforcement with business negotiations. And the reason I don't claim to be a business negotiator, although I speak to a lot of business groups, is I'm just not into contracts and when to make your proposal, when to counter. That's just not what I'm about. But I do talk about relationship building and interpersonal communications and the lessons I learned from law enforcement crisis hostage negotiations and how I think those things apply. I think too often in the business world, people get overly focused on the structure and the cookbook recipe for pursuing a deal, structuring the team to take on a difficult conversation with a client. And that's all good stuff. I don't shortchange any of it. It's just not what I do. So, to me, the world revolves around relationships, everything we do. And I think if you have developed the capacity to forge good relationships with people, then that will accrue to doing good business and sustaining business. Not only getting new customers, but when I became a consultant after I retired from the FBI, one of the mottos of the company I worked for was, we don't want to be hunters, we want to be farmers. And if you stop to think about it, there is a certain amount of your work where you have to always go out and seek new business and new customers, I suppose, in most businesses. But the real value is when you have strong, sustaining relationships with key clients that are continuing business that you can count on, and you need to invest time and effort into making sure that you're uh, engaged in the care and feeding of those relationships. So so that's some of the differences there. You mentioned the behavioral change stairway model. The only
Yeah.
thing I changed on it, I developed that in the 90s for the FBI, not as a step-by-step cookbook. You have to do this, and then you have to do that, and then you climb to this. I really designed it as a graph, as an illustration of the fact that the relationship building that I just talked about a little while ago is a process. We don't just start out and say, I'm a nice guy. You should look at me as a nice guy. Now let's make a deal. We have to invest the time and energy into creating that relationship, to demonstrating our appreciation of the other person's point of view and perspective and problems and needs and all that sort of stuff. And we have to show that we want to learn more. We're interested. Doesn't mean we agree with everything they're saying or doing, but
Right.
I think when we do that as individuals or business people, we in turn set ourselves up to be treated in kind, and that's that relationship building piece. Now, the only thing I used to call the whole behavioral change stairway model behavioral, that's what it is, behavioral change stairway. But the top step was behavioral change, and I thought after I retired that I liked the top step to be denoted as cooperation, because perhaps more in the law enforcement context than the business, but in the law enforcement context, that's what we're really seeking. We're not seeking to make this individual we're trying to get to surrender a better person. We're not trying to alter their life. We're just trying to get their cooperation right now so they don't harm themselves or someone else. So I think it's a more clear destination, but either way you use it is fine. Most people still use the old way, but I've been, last 20 years, I like it. It rings truer for me when I put cooperation, because at the end of the day, as human beings, being social animals, everything we do is about cooperation and conflict avoidance, gaining cooperation, influence, and accomplishing tasks that are to our benefit.
Yeah, it reminds me of my communication. It was the three C's. You got compromise, competition, and then there's collaboration, cooperation. Which coming straight from the military boat, I said, no, but don't you want to compete and destroy? Don't you want to, And listening to a lot of your interviews, you also kind of, and some posts on LinkedIn, starting to happen where people are saying, boy, the military and the police, military is weaponized. Shouldn't weaponize the police. Also, what you're doing is you're weaponizing them with an empathy tool set. And that's genius. You mentioned you've reduced the department's call out rate for cops to go put handcuffs by 70% by having the 911 operator just do some basic listening to the situation, which I kind of think it's also not comical, but interesting that your toughest negotiations is actually a domestic with a guy holding a girlfriend or a baby hostage, causing harm. That really, that really blew my mind.
Well, there's a wide range of incidents that negotiators and law enforcement respond to. I mean, you mentioned the typical, and that's the guy drunk on Friday night and he beats his wife up, and she calls the police, and the police show up, and and we end up having a fight with the guy, and then the wife who's been beaten up then turns on the police. I mean, it's the kind of classic little crisis, but those can be
Yeah,
quite dangerous, and they normally end all right, but oftentimes when we see loss of life or serious injury, it's in those situations that, is this one going to be like 90% of them, or is this one going to turn really bad? And then you go all the way to the far end of dealing with a group of terrorists, and there's there are similarities throughout the spectrum, but there's also quite a few differences, and negotiators have to be, kind of prepared to handle the whole gamut of what we're dealing with. And I'm not against the use of force, and I think that's why police departments have tactical teams, and the
Yeah.
military is more likely to apply that if they're deployed to a troublesome area. But for law enforcement, we've always said we'll use the least amount of force necessary, and that's sort of the constitutional mandate. And we haven't always practiced that, but it's easier to escalate than it is to start off violently and then try to say, okay, forget about all that. Now let's talk and be friends. I mean, we want to give everybody the opportunity
Yeah.
to make better decisions, to cooperate with us, to not harm themselves or someone else. Negotiations has an enormously successful rate of in the 90 percentile. But the fact that it's not 100% means we have to be ready, because there are some bad people. There are people who will kill themselves and they'll kill other people. And the real challenge is getting them to turn away from that, but also recognizing those that are likely to be unmoved by our efforts. But I think we have to show. I always say this to groups when we as law enforcement respond to an incident, and it ends badly. I think we have to be able to articulate in a court of law and a court of public opinion that the actions that we ultimately took, that perhaps took someone's life, we were left with no choice. The behavior, the statements, the threats, the things that the perpetrator did can clearly be judged as having left us no choice but to use force. It was not our preferred choice. It was not our desired choice. It was not the first card we played, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the individuals that decide the outcome in any case are the people we're facing. We can control our own emotions and our own actions, but to be truthful and honest with ourselves, we never fully control them. We influence them, and we've learned the skills that help us to be, as I mentioned earlier, successful far more than not. There's some
Yeah.
analogy to what the military does, but there's also some differences.
And I think that's a great segue to what led me to creating this show is I don't know if you heard of Daniel Shapiro, Negotiating the
Uh,
Non-Negotiable.
there's so many negotiation books. I don't know if I've read Daniel's book or not. Possibly have.
Well, he speaks on kind of like where you're alluding to, that when you're emotionally involved, it makes it tough. And I know for you, your example is Waco, where the hostage taker essentially started the conversation with how to pronounce his last name, and so I thought the way you went about it was very amicable, very nice. But the way that when he answered how to pronounce his last name, it was he said it sounds like a gargle death. That's how you pronounce it. And so I cannot imagine being the negotiator on that call
You're talking about
and already
Koresh when
getting
he said
triggered.
it's like dying breath or something. Koresh.
Yes. Oh gosh, I said immediately. I'm already triggered. I'm gonna hand this off to to someone else in the bus here. And I think we find ourselves in that emotionally triggered, and we're trying to negotiate. All the tools. God bless Chris Voss's N9 tools. Many will testify that all those tools just go out the window, and you're left with these emotions.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to criticize any other approach, and I think a lot of people sometimes get a little too caught up though with specific tools and look at the process as a recipe. To me, the biggest detriment to an effective negotiator is to try to be something that you're not naturally. I mean, I think rather than follow a script, um, if you have learned the ability, or naturally may have it, to come across as sincere and genuine, likable, empathic, I think your chances of success are pretty high. I can't guarantee an outcome. That's another thing a lot of business negotiators say. Always do these 6 things and get the outcome you want. Never do those 4 things. Well, that's
right?
not my wheelhouse at all. I'm going to say, hey, if you engage with people in this way, you stand a very high chance of being successful. But I can't guarantee you success. I'm not in the head of the other party that you're dealing with. I don't know what their issues, concerns, and position is. I think, you control yourself. I always say it was the first thing I taught for 40 years now, self-control. It's the only
Mm,
true thing you can control, your own emotions. So I think as a negotiator, there is sometimes a problem if we fill someone's head with too many things to worry about and think about. You end up coming across in a very rigid, insincere way, and I think that puts somebody in a bad situation. I knew in the FBI and teaching law enforcement was, I knew some people who were very capable, very smart, but when you put them in the hot chair of a negotiation,
uh,
they all of a sudden tried to act and do things that was not reflective of how they normally function. And they would fail. They wouldn't be very successful. And I would say, be yourself, pretend like you're talking to a good friend who's going through some challenging times in life. That's what you want to be. You don't want to just pretend to be empathic. You want to be empathic. And I think that aspect is woefully underrated in the business community because I think the business community doesn't necessarily want to hear from me telling them all this soft and fuzzy gray stuff. They want a recipe. They want a cookbook. Give me the template. So, I'll know how to
yeah.
do this. And that's all. That's
And
fine. I don't. Yeah, go ahead.
statistically, 80% of them regress to their old methodology.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the stats are on that, but I suspect there's a lot of truth to
It
what you
is.
said there. I think people, I think if you can just really train people to listen to what others are saying and to respond effectively, to pick up the emotions, to pick up. There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know. Let me get back to you on that. I'd like to hear more. I don't understand. Could you explain that to me again? These are all things you would do with someone in your personal life that you were having a serious conversation with. And why shouldn't we use them in a business context? You avoid getting angry and saying things that you'll regret later on. Even if you don't get that client's business, don't burn a bridge. It's been my experience that a lot of companies, not all, but there's a percentage of companies that buy a product simply on who's the lowest price, period. That's the total decision making criteria. And oftentimes they end up being disappointed with what they get because they went with a poor quality vendor. Well, if you've already burned the bridge with them and put a bad taste in their mouth when you were making your pitch, they may not come back to you. But if you say to them, like, well, it looks like you're moving in a different direction and a price point is very important to you, and I hope everything works out well for you. But if it does not, I hope you'll remember us and reach out again to us because we'd like to try to work with you if we can to our mutual benefit. And you might find that they come back to you later on. You haven't burned that bridge. You haven't left a bad taste in anyone's mouth. I've seen this happen more often than I can tell you.
Hmm. It's all about follow up now. It's like, well, they said no. You better reach out to them twice a week and agitate the counterpart.
Yeah, I mean, what I would do, I mean, it depends on what the relationship. If you would say, hey, Daniel, I know we didn't get the business, and that's fine. I understand it. I'm not trying to resell you here, but I wonder if you'd be kind enough to tell me what do you think it is that we came short on? What did we? I'd like to learn. I'd like to. The next person I talk to, like you, I'd like to be more successful. Do you have any tips for me? Any ideas? And some people will wave you off. We know that, but there'll be some people say, well, Gary, now that you mentioned it. I thought this person on your team was far too aggressive and they just didn't give us a
Mm,
good feeling. Well, you need to know that for your business so you can make whatever adjustments in personnel or strategy or tactics that you can. So go back to them and look for a critique. Said, well, I really appreciate that, and next time you have something that we can compete for, I'm trying to take these lessons to heart and I want to be better. who doesn't respect somebody that wants to learn and improve their game? I mean, I think universally most all of us do.
Yeah, it's better than the other spectrum coming off as arrogant,
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to move
authoritative.
locations. I'm going to move locations here, but keep chatting.
And speaking about, no one's ever been able to get a glimpse in these serious negotiations about humor. And so we know humor is a direct route to building that French rapport. Has there ever been a humorous moment in a serious
Oh yeah,
negotiation?
yeah. It
Do you
doesn't
even or you just stay away from? We kind of
typically.
learned that if they laugh first, it's giving you permission. How do you handle that?
Well, I think you have to be careful with that. I think there are uh, occasional opportunities where, I mean, even David Koresh with that terrible, terrible tragedy, there were times where he would joke about food in a local restaurant or make some little
Mm,
quip. And it's okay to respond to that in a humorous fashion. You know, hey, I know what you mean. I had a place like that that made me sick once too. That's okay, but you don't want to go in there and say, hey, I know this is difficult negotiation, but let me tell you about this joke. Two guys walk into a bar. I mean, you wouldn't do that. You know what I'm saying? So you have to really be really careful and control. It's not a joke. It's not a laughing matter. Certainly not in the law enforcement context. But I mean, I think humor, like a lot of tools, has its place. It's just not the first, not near the top of the deck of cards that I would play for sure.
right. And so there was one big presentation you did in front of a big crowd. And at the end of it, I wondered, I don't know if he was joking. At the end, he said, I'm kidding, I'm a negotiator. The example you gave was your wife, you're with the remote, and she goes, "Arr, arr," grunts, and then you grunt back. And then she gets on the phone with someone for an hour. And now she's really upset at you because she doesn't understand man talk when you grunt back, meaning, hey, I'm open to listen. Do you find yourself in real conflicts in personal life,
Sure. I mean,
or was that just like a imaginary example of a normal
well, I
person
mean, it
handling?
like a lot of good stories in a presentation. It's an embellishment that's loosely based on facts, but it
Okay.
illustrates the point that, and I do it in the context of a husband and wife, that as husbands, businessmen, particularly military and law enforcement, we tend to want to solve a problem very quickly when in reality our
Yeah.
significant others may only really want us to understand and listen to what they have to say. And no, if my wife was on this podcast there, she would laugh and she would say, "And you go around the world teaching active listening skills?" I mean, there's the old saying about you're never a prophet at home, and we take advantage of people that are dear to us and mean the world to us, and sometimes we don't give them our full attention. And I'm as guilty as that as the next person. And I even at my advanced old age and experience, I try to be better at that, but I come up short time and time again. I mean, it's amazing. Sometimes you can be more attentive to a complete stranger in a crisis situation than you can to
Yeah.
somebody close to your whole life. And there's a lot of history to those relationships that you carry into it. In my former line of work, when we're dealing with someone in a hostage barricade situation, you don't have any of that history. So you can come across and be this likable, nice, helpful person that maybe if you tried that same line with somebody that's known you for 20 years, they would say, what's going on here? This isn't the old Gary that I know. Um, so, but what you really have to do is be sincere and not be phony. I think a lot of salespeople, there's the old joke about the proverbial car salesman, that
Mm.
they too quickly often feign familiarity and a friendship that essentially they just haven't earned the right to have yet.
It's
And those are people that I don't like doing business with at all. I want the I want the salesman that's like Columbo. He's over in the corner of the showroom and
yeah.
comes sauntering over and says, "Hey, I see you're looking for a new car. I'm not going to bother you. If you have any questions, I'm over there sitting down." Well, that's the guy I'm going to go to. The guy that follows you around 3 steps behind you in the showroom
It's like
and
commission
starts asking
breakfast.
where do you go on vacation? What does your family do? What do you like? And that guy's like a gnat, and I don't want anything to do with him.
And that is the actual example of right now the leading sales coach out there using empathy method. He actually points to that was an actual sales thing of, oh, you went to the Bahamas for vacation? I did too.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. And, if you're caught lying, that's like the ultimate report destroyer out there.
All of this stuff is circumstantial. You go over to that Columbo's desk and he's got a picture of a king mackerel he caught, and you happen to be a guy that likes to do offshore fishing. You might say, "Oh, you're a fisherman. Yeah, where'd you catch that one?" That's fine, but when it's
Yeah, it's
introduced in
natural.
a false or phony way, it's too quick. I mean, these guys are under a lot of pressure. They're trying to sell cars. It's a dog eat dog world, and I'm not just picking on car salesmen here, but everybody has quotas. Everybody has to sell widgets and perform and to succeed. So it's quite easy for them to become overly eager and overly pushy. And I think that works to a certain extent. But for a lot of discriminating buyers, consumers, that can be a big turnoff. And it certainly always has been with me. And I think that's why if you talk to, not to pick on the car industry again, but you talk to a lot of people, buying a new car is one of the most unpleasant things they'll bring up. It's just not a pleasant experience because you got to go through that, run the gamut of this sort of very aggressive salesmanship. You got to be strong enough to walk away from that stuff.
And and feelings of empathy for the car salesman. That's a quick way to burn out. Which is one thing I admire about a lot of these retired negotiators like yourself is you haven't burned out. Is almost like you caught steam. You even in retirement changed the behavioral change stairway. You made a modification. And I know for a lot of folks listening, that's kind of inspirational that you really, even if you retire from, let's say, a lot of companies start implementing negotiators into their company, right? I think that's be the perfect profession. You won't burn out. You'll always be curious to learn more. And we hope that happens more where companies, have their own in-house negotiator, the soft tools.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think good interpersonal communication skills don't necessarily have to be limited to conducting a formalized negotiation. I think every supervisor should have a better understanding how to talk to his or her subordinates. How do you deal with a challenging coworker? How do you, how do you talk to your big boss? Things like that. I think if we think about how we are seen and how we interact with others, I mean, I think it has pretty broad application across the business spectrum. And I think companies would be wise to provide that kind of enrichment training for their employees to make a more harmonious workplace. And I think it's a proven factor that enhances productivity. And then we've all heard about the toxic workplaces that some people run, and nobody wants to work there. And it's the boss is a little dictator and a pain in the ass, and the turnover is significant. That this costs companies a lot of money. You
They
know,
said
yeah,
70%
yeah,
leave
it's a
because of
it's
the
a big
cost.
waste. Now, I think today's environment is far more conducive to portability and people changing companies more than they did when I was your age. But still, I think good companies, you would know the stats more than me, but I think good companies that have a reputation as being a healthy work environment, I think their employee retention is much higher, and that's a worthy goal.
And it's don't know if you heard of a website called Glassdoor,
You know,
which the employees write about their company.
uh,
Uh, Transparency is key. And speaking of, I know you only give us 30 minutes, which is a lot, and we're very grateful. Is there any final words, anything you haven't said on a podcast or show that you've been wanting to get out there?
I do so many. I know at the top of the show you mentioned, not to be a one-trick pony, but there are two TV. I mean, my book, Stalling for Time. Obviously, I would hope that link to your website or something if people are
Yeah,
interested in hearing more about my career in the negotiation profession. But also, the Netflix is coming out with a three-part
that's huge.
exhaustive documentary on Waco on March 22nd um, that I was involved in, and it shows some never before seen negotiation footage from inside the negotiation room, and I think it's going to be a very comprehensive and very accurate portrayal of what really went on because there's so much misinformation. And of course, they're doing this because it's the 30th anniversary of Waco coming up February 28th. The other
Right.
thing is Showtime is coming out with a five-part dramatic series. It's the second
Wow.
season. Paramount came out in 2018 with a six-part dramatic series, and Michael Shannon played me uh, in that show. And they are releasing the second season, which is called Waco: The Aftermath. It's what happened after Waco. That I think will be pretty good. Michael Shannon's playing me again. And that comes out, I believe they just announced April 14th, I think, or 16th, something like that. So, your listeners may want to, viewers may want to check those out. I mean, the Showtime one is sort of my character is pretty much fictionalized for this particular season, but the Netflix one will be again. There's a difference between a documentary and a dramatic series. So, of
Are
course, they
you
love.
on set for the dramatic series?
Yeah, I
Or are they
took.
calling you?
No, I went out for a bit and
Oh, wow.
consulted on that. I consulted on both of these, and yeah, I mean it's an interesting thing to see how they make a movie. And when you sell your book rights, as I did, you have some influence, but you have no control. And Hollywood is like any other business; they have their own idea about doing things, and a lot of it's very creative and interesting, and some of it it's like, I don't think I would have said it that way, but they do things for dramatic license that they feel serves their needs to have people watch the show. But it's you got to be careful when something is not a documentary. Don't you know put a grain of salt to it. Whereas documentary tends to be more factual. But I would watch them both. I think they'll be great.
Good. I mean, stalling for time. When you really when you really open up the hood and you look for methodologies, it sounds so simple. Staying silent with the counterpart, stall for time. It kind of builds a bit of rapport and empathy. When you try it in practice, though, it you just it just seems like it's impossible. It's a tall order. So
Well,
lots of kudos and respect for you to be able to sit with someone and
You'll find that
not.
in human interaction, if you slow things down sometimes, when humans talk to one another, we get into a pattern of response and statement and response. And if you're quiet for a while, there's a tendency for the other human to fill that space by saying something. And as a negotiator, you want to hear what they have to say because when you're speaking, you're not learning anything. You want to listen
That's right.
for that person. So, and I certainly improved through the years from when I started, but you want to try to become a really good listener. And, you do that by in your responses. That's why we call it active listening. You restate the content and, and you reflect the feelings you hear. And if you do those things, you will be an effective communicator, and it's like anything else in life. You practice these things and become proficient at it. And, it'll work to your benefit. So, stalling for time, I just got that title because in the medical profession they say first do no harm. As a negotiator, if you do nothing else, stall for time, because the passage of time lowers emotions and allows things to cool off. So I'll leave it on that note.
Thank you so much. and I'm going to give my best effort here. Thank you so much, Mr. No, sir.
Nessner. Just think NESSNER or NESNER. No O.
Thank you so much.